I've just been speaking at a KPMG taxation summit with around 500 heads of taxation from some of the largest companies in the world. And they're facing very complicated times as governments seek to catch up with the strategies of globalized institutions to avoid paying tax, to move from high tax environments to low tax environments. And the fact is that taxation rates are converging in many territories because these countries are essentially in competition with each other. And it's becoming really quite difficult for governments to tax corporations effectively because they are usually much more sophisticated than these global multinationals are much more sophisticated at switching operations than companies that are only based in one territory on the one hand, or let's say wealthy citizens on the other. Now, one of the challenges for corporations is to keep track with some of the wider changes that are happening in our society, which themselves will impact taxation policy. And let's look at a few of those. Well, firstly, there's the demographic explosion. 1 billion children are alive today who will be adults within the next 15 to 18 years. That has never happened before in recorded history and will never happen again. At the same time, we're seeing aggressive urbanization. 750 million people in Africa will live in cities by 2020. The Chinese government is planning to move 23 million citizens into cities from rural areas every year between now and then. That's a total of 300 million people. At the same time, we're seeing a growing contrast between the very wealthiest in societies and the poorest, not only between nations, but right inside them, whether that's in Shanghai or in Kolkata, in Mumbai on the one hand, or in Singapore on the other. And this is creating all kinds of new tensions for the future and new challenges in terms of taxation. And then, of course, there's the tremendous race to secure commodities, which has produced the escalating oil prices, food prices, aluminium prices, steel prices, copper prices, and so on. And when we're thinking about oil, we have a situation in the Western world where many governments are beginning to consider their own national security and well-being, when the great bulk of oil reserves, proven oil reserves, still reside in places like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, and so on. And then there's the subprime crisis, with now 10% of all homes in Cleveland repossessed. We've seen 1% of new of homes in Oregon served with repossession orders just in the last 4 weeks. That's in May 2008. And it is emotion which will have a fundamental role in deciding taxation in the future. And why is that? Because politicians, whether they are in democracies or in dictatorships, are sensitive to opinion, either of the people as a whole who will elect them, or of their own constituencies that they play to in the case of non-democracies. And when we look back at history, we see that it's emotional reactions to events which have driven the future rather than the events themselves. And that's why it's so important that we look at the emotional climate, because we're seeing huge mood changes taking place in 2008. And when we look at several different issues, and these are already playing out in terms of changes in regulation and changes in taxation. It's all part of the shift from the old left-right political systems to a world where governments are very much influenced by single-issue activists on narrow agendas, running campaigns, which are often radical and, as I say, sometimes irrational. And the fact is that compliance is now dead as a strategy to drive a business for the future. You cannot just drive a business on innovation and complying with regulations. Compliance is a very good way, whether it's compliance with environmental regulations, compliance with tax regulations. It's a very good way to keep you out of prison, but it will not protect your brand, it will not protect your own career, it will not protect your reputation. And the reason for that is simple. Compliance is always a process of fitting in with previous regulations and previous court judgments. And they, of course, are history. They themselves were created as reactions to previous events. So we have compliance teams which are essentially complying with the outcomes of events 3, 4, 5 or even 10 years ago. And there are many examples where the world mood has changed faster than compliance has, and where teams have been 100% compliant in every single year with tax policy, with accounting procedures, with environmental regulations and the rest, but have still been hammered. An example of this is bribery. It was perfectly legal in some European countries until quite recently, not only to pay a bribe in a foreign territory, but also to claim the tax back on that bribe as a fully justifiable business expense. So the more you bribe, the more tax you got back. In fact, the government was paying you to bribe, you could say. Now, that would not be any valid defense if, let's say today, an executive was called up for interview on CNN and called to defend the fact that they had signed off on various emails going back to 95, 6, 7, showing that they were well aware of large bribes being paid to get, let's say, a franchise opportunity in an emerging economy somewhere, in a capital city. It's no good saying on CNN, oh yes, well, you know, the bribes were perfectly legal at the time, we declared them as a tax-deductible expense, our auditors signed off at them, and we're perfectly at liberty to have done it then. The fact is, the world has moved on. And although, as I say, such a defense may keep you out of prison, it would not be enough to prevent you from losing your job, to stop you from ever working, let's say, in financial services again, and from destroying a big chunk of the value of your brand, of your image, your corporate image. Now, when we look at the issues of sustainability, we see just how rapidly public mood is changing and how fast with legislators, regulators and tax advisors, etc., are trying to catch up. Let's look at global warming. 3 years ago, hardly a single head of state was talking about this issue, and now most of them are talking about it on a weekly basis. 3 years ago, it was hardly on the agenda of legislators or those who are looking to implement new tax environments, and now it's centre stage. Now, we can debate about the science, and the science is unproven. I happen to think that the science is overwhelmingly conclusive, but it could turn out to be wrong. That's irrelevant. For the purposes of this debate, the real issue is this: how much passion, how much emotion is attached to the global warming question? How much more passion is likely to be attached to those graphs showing the rise of carbon dioxide over the next 5 to 10 years? And the answer is a huge amount more passion. And that passion will drive agendas. Those agendas will campaign for change. And those campaigns for change will result in new regulation and new tax incentives on the one hand and disincentives on the other. So you can expect the entire global business environment to be influenced territory by territory by the global warming issues. And it might be subsidies for renewables. It could be extra taxation on processes which are deemed to be inefficient. But we will also see knee-jerk reactions by government creating really bad policies which in turn 2 or 3 years later are completely changed. And a prime example where we can expect this is, of course, in the area of biofuels, and where we've seen an absurd logic. We've seen governments fuse oil and food prices together by allowing a mechanism by which food can be put into vehicles, after being converted, of course, into gasoline or diesel, and indeed put into planes for that matter. With this massive urbanisation, we've seen hundreds of millions of people move off the land where they were out of the food market because they grew their own food essentially. And they're now in cities living in shacks on very low incomes where they've been spending up to 80% of their income every day buying food from other people who are still in the rural areas. Now, if food prices double or treble, you can't eat. And when you've sold the very dishes in which you cook to buy more food, when you've sold the spare clothes that you have, when you've sold every object in your home to feed your family, what do? The answer is you riot, you burn cars, you smash up shops, and you make a protest statement to the government. And that is exactly what has been happening, and already one government has fallen. So the biofuel industry is going to come under a huge rethink because of these emotional pressures, which will cause a re-evaluation, the change of government subsidies, the change of regulations. And we're going to see this kind of switch in other areas too. So watch this space. Taxation is complicated. In every territory, governments are thinking about more imaginative ways to tax people and companies without killing off their own economies. And companies and people are always looking for creative ways to avoid those taxes.